Hi, and welcome to the subcase number 3 in our human rights impacts of unconventional gas. In subcase number 3, we're going to look at climate change impacts and impacts on the environment, specifically the human rights impacts that this industry has on our climate system, and that impacts our present and our future generations. We're looking at how the CO2 intensive extraction process impacts our system, our climate system. We're also looking at how the fugitive and intentional methane releases also impact our climate system. We're also addressing the continued reliance on fossil fuels and how that will impact our climate change. Also, these impacts have similar effects on our environment, specifically our ecosystems, oceans and wildlife, and the depletion of our ground and surface waters. Now, I'm going to provide here a summary of some of the issues that are associated with this subcase, but there is bound to be many other issues, and there are bound to be very specific ways that these issues impact you personally. So we'd like to invite you to provide your personal witness statements or your personal testimony that supports this case and in the specific ways that it has impacted you. So, to start with, the fossil fuels choice is this industry. The pursuit of fossil fuels has been to the detriment of investment in and development in renewable resources. Basically, our government has made a series of choices that has selected fossil fuels over our renewable options, and also they have specifically focused on creating this gas industry as a specific choice, as opposed to choices of other renewable options. The government has specifically legislated a portion of electricity production had to be from this gas. Then they continued in supporting this industry by having a productivity commission to ease the red and green tape that this industry was supposed to be exposed to. The government has also been so led by the desires of the multinationals, instead of the good of the country, that in their dash to create an export industry for the gas industry, they destroyed the supply and demand basis for pricing and eliminated the domestic supply that they had previously legislated had to be used. So basically, let's look at the scale of this industry. You can see here various parts of the Western Downs, and over a period of just a few years, the scar and the scale that this industry has on the landscape. So looking at the scale of this industry, it is absolutely unprecedented, the impact that this industry must have on the environment. There are a catalogue of environmental impacts that this industry has, some of which are specifically the voracious demand for water, especially groundwater, and in particular the liberation of methane and carbon dioxide, which are potent greenhouse gases, into the atmosphere. Those are two specific impacts that we'll investigate a little further in this presentation. So the planned scale and scope of the development of this industry makes the whole question of those environmental impacts much more complex. So these projects are licensed on a piecemeal method. They are licensed on an individual basis. That does not allow for the cumulative impacts to be addressed. It doesn't allow for a big picture perspective on what those impacts are and how predictable they will be on such a scale. And in fact, potentially, those impacts are much more systemic when environmental systems are exposed to such a disturbance on an enormous scale. So methane is the climate fugitive at the moment. In this industry, and we've already discussed this in subcase number 1 for health, the sum of the fugitive emissions of this industry, which includes the emissions that are addressed in the National Pollutant Inventory and the emissions that are not addressed, when they are put together, they do not allow the industry to wash up, as the spin suggests, as this cleaner than coal, this bridging fuel between dirty coal and clean environmental options. In fact, there's been research done, and one particular person, Tim Forsey, has undertaken research that indicates methane emissions from this industry are a concealed climate change threat. And it's concealed because it's hidden, it's invisible, and it's unmeasured. The emissions that are coming from this industry are hidden, invisible, and unmeasured. And this is a really significant issue when we're looking at potential impacts on climate change. And as a climate fugitive, methane, we know, is a powerful greenhouse gas. It's up to 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. There has been no real baseline of methane emissions prior to this industry taking place, and that gives this industry plausible deniability. In fact, the only independent study that's been undertaken so far was a study undertaken by Southern Cross Uni with Douglas Tate and his cohorts, that they found by studying concentrations inside the gas field and outside the gas field that there were elevated concentrations of methane within the gas field, and that was proved in this study. So we now know without a doubt that the fugitive emissions of methane in this industry are a serious concern for climate change. And we also know from other research that's been conducted that there is evidence that suggests that just being even conservative, if we were to keep to our promise of only a 2% rise in temperature, as was committed in the Paris Agreement, then we have to leave 90% of our fossil fuels in the ground. And traumatically, we are being taken to task by our neighbours who will be the first to be affected by the government and industry's decision to pursue this fossil fuel and not keep it in the ground. Our Pacific Islander neighbours are saying that Australia is stuck in the dark ages. Our neighbours are saying that we need to be aware of the fact that climate change is destroying their islands and their way of life, and our industry and our pursuit of fossil fuels is contributing to that. So if we were to assume that the government was able to convince us that their concerns regarding climate change match the community's concerns, and they referred us, as they do, to their environmental impact assessment process that provides the rigour to which this industry must be held to, and that through which this is the method that they will manage impacts of climate change, well, then they would still be failing. Let's have a look at a few examples of that. So, Simone Marsh preempted these failures in her multiple whistleblower submissions, and she provides in her submissions evidence in a list of things, including baseline data that wasn't available, scientific rigour that was not undertaken, star chamber protective behaviours that were established, and the fatally flawed mantra of adaptive management that the government hangs its head on as being able to permit this industry to be rolled out. So that environmental impact assessment process only addresses individual projects, and that may produce a number of constraints, but the environmental impact assessment process are only site-specific. They're only temporarily constrained, and they are limited in covering the cumulative effects on the environment. This current method fails to address the aggregate of environmental impacts. And those aggregate of those individual projects are going to be a greater sum than the individual effects. So basically, the environmental impact assessment process that is being used currently does not address the cumulative impacts of multiple projects over time. So ultimately, the environment is looking at a death by 1,000 small cuts. Let's look at an example of this. A study was undertaken, a study called From the Seam to the Stove. And in that study, an assessment was undertaken across 2 states and multiple projects. That study looked at the way in which the environmental impact statements were reviewed in the coverage of emissions of greenhouse gases. So as you can see in this table, those projects were assessed. The impact or the way in which emissions were addressed was given a colour. So the green colour was given where the assessment in the impact statement provided a quantitative assessment and it discussed the emission and the sources. The orange colour was given to projects where the emission sources was calculated, but it was done so with exceptions. And the red colour was allocated to the projects where the source of emissions was not estimated with any justification, or it just wasn't, the source of emissions was just not recognised at all. So you can see the outstanding colour there is red. So across multiple projects, the government isn't even consistent in requiring that emission sources and the emissions of greenhouse gases are dealt with any consistency whatsoever. So groundwater dependent ecosystems are impacted by the extraction of water, and that allows gas migration through the system. And this presents risks for aquifers, for groundwater users, and for groundwater dependent ecosystems. And in the government's own documentation in reviewing this risk, the government itself says that the risk for the Condamine alluvium at present is mainly related to their uncertainties they have regarding the interaction of aquifers. Basically, the assumption that aquifers are not connected. Another study was undertaken, particularly with regard to environmental authorities that are given by the government to the projects. Several projects were set up side by side, and what was assessed was the different parameters and expectations that were placed on each environmental authority. And as you can see here, under estimated water extraction, one of the projects was required to model it based on the head drop to depressurize, and 3 of the projects didn't even estimate the water extraction. That project, that assessment, goes on to discuss that particularly, ultimately, that there is no baseline data or ongoing monitoring requirements for methane in atmospheric air quality, that there was no, that any baseline conditions were sourced from areas that were up to 300 kilometres away from the actual gas field that the EA was in relation to, and that although they were required to include parameters in atmospheric emissions, including those particular chemicals and compounds, these were modelled in order to describe the existing environment. There was no monitoring or validation of these models, and there was no ongoing monitoring program required. So there is absolutely no consistency across the project's environmental authorities as to how discharge limits of water is dealt with, or how atmospheric conditions are dealt with, or even the requirement to measure the emissions of methane to the atmosphere. Yet another study was undertaken to identify what were the potential hazards and exposure pathways in Queensland from coal seam gas water. This study provided here it provides a table of the elements and compounds that are found within coal seam gas, lists the concentrations that were found, and compares them to Australian drinking water references. It then goes on to identify the ways in which the CSG water is used and how that may provide a population with exposure to those chemicals and compounds. And the study found that the CSG water was providing exposure pathways to the population in just about any which way it could. And this is a table that then goes on to summarise those exposure pathways. So everything from beneficial use, surface releases, underground releases, or containment of CSG water, provided direct pathways to exposing the population to those compounds and chemicals found in the coal seam gas water. None of this is dealt with in the environmental authorities. None of it is dealt with in the environmental impact statements because, of course, health impacts and social impacts are not addressed in any way, shape or form. This is all based on that adaptive management philosophy, and despite the proof that warnings from whistleblowers are actually coming to pass, that there is obviously inadequate science, there is inadequate oversights and inadequate constraints, our nation is in dire straits in terms of climate change and environmental impacts of this industry. This industry has continued to progress despite that. This industry has continued to progress despite the fact that there is limited groundwater monitoring data, that impacts and risk assessments may take decades to actually undertake, and by that time the impacts may have already happened, and those impacts will persist for long periods of time. And to be very practical, these hazards and risks are the greatest for the aquifers east of Roma, west and southwest of Chinchilla, and west of Dalby, which coincidentally is very highly productive agricultural areas and communities and ecologies that are dependent on that water. So what does it take for the government to listen? So they continue to respond to the public's concern in denial and bloody-minded ignorance, despite the fact that recently there was a review undertaken of 685 peer-reviewed scientific papers on the impacts of this industry. And out of those 685 peer-reviewed papers, statistics of what they found was phenomenal. They found massively high levels of findings in each of those papers that indicated that there was definitely a public health risk from this industry. There were public health hazards. There were elevated risks to health outcomes. There was actual incidences of water contamination and atmospheric pollutants and emissions. So the evidence is in, the scientific data is in. So there is obviously anything but a precautionary approach being taken to coal seam gas development in Australia. The technology for the industry is novel. It's not yet standardised. It's poorly understood. And the worst case potential for the harm that is possible is enormous. When you look at the scale of the development, it is so large that by addressing it in the way it is being dealt with, there is no way the cumulative impacts could even start to be considered. So surely this is the very definition of human and earth right impacts. So that's just a brief summary of the basic impacts that this industry has in particular regard to climate change and the environment. Please contact us to provide us your testimony regarding how this industry has impacted you. Please contact us on these contact details if you would like any help or to discuss how you would like to provide us with your testimony. Thank you for listening.